I think it starts with just ordinary people changing the way they think about politics. I think in some ways the left-right myth is kind of like it's an addiction, and the way to get rid of an addiction is to recognize you have a problem, right? Alcoholics Anonymous, the first step, I have a problem, right? I think that's what we have to do with left-right thinking. Recognize that it's a myth.
I found that ideas were weapons and were even more effective than bullets.
As one who knows that another war could utterly destroy this civilization, I wish I could say tonight that a lasting peace is in sight.
The United States, as the world knows, will never start a war.
The contest in Vietnam is part of a wider pattern of aggressive purposes.
We force young black men and young white men to fight and kill in brutal solidarity. Yet when they come back home, they can't hardly live on the same block.
The white liberal differs from the white conservative only in one way. The white liberal is able to use the Negro as a pawn or a weapon in this political football game.
If you want to understand the way some system works, you look at its institutional structure.
Welcome to Ambiology. I'm Steve Ordauer. Today's conversation sits right at the heart of what this show is all about. We're joined by Dr. Verlan Lewis, co-author along with his brother Hyrum of The Myth of Left and Right: How the Political Spectrum Misleads and Harms America. It's a book that has had a profound impact on how we, the producers of this show, Blake Minnerly and myself, understand the political landscape in the United States. And it has deeply informed the structure and purpose of this podcast. At first glance, the core idea might sound almost too simple. There is more than one issue in politics. But what Lewis and his co-authors show, through history, social science, and careful reasoning, is that we continue to rely on a framework that assumes the opposite. We compress a complex, multi-dimensional reality into a single line, left versus right, as if everything we believe can be neatly sorted into two opposing camps. And that assumption doesn't just oversimplify, it distorts. It shapes how we see each other. It encourages us to believe that if someone disagrees with us on one issue, they must be wrong about everything else. It pushes us toward tribal thinking, where politics becomes less about ideas and more about identity, about who's on the good team and who's on the bad team. But what happens when that framework starts to break down? What happens when positions we associate with left versus right shift over time, sometimes dramatically? When parties change, coalitions realign, and the things we thought were foundational suddenly are not? And what happens when you realize that your own beliefs don't fit neatly into either box? That tension, that moment of cognitive dissonance is where this conversation begins. In this episode, hosts Blake Minnerly and Dr. Lewis explore the difference between philosophy and tribal identity, why highly educated people may be more prone to ideological conformity, how political bundles of belief form and shift, and what it might look like to think about politics in a more grounded, principled, and human way. This is a conversation about stepping outside the frame we've been given and asking whether it was ever the right one to begin with. We're pleased to bring you this thought-provoking conversation with Dr. Verlan Lewis.
So welcome to Ambiology, and today we have with us Dr. Verlan Lewis, who's going to be discussing he and his brother Hyrum's book, The Myth of Left and Right: How the Political Spectrum Misleads and Harms America, an amazing and important text that has had a profound influence on my perception of our political reality and very much informed the structure of this show. So we're very much honored to have you here today, Dr. Lewis.
Oh, thanks so much for having me on, Blake.
Oh, my pleasure. and very much looking forward to this conversation. So, we're going to have lots of time to dig into the nuts and bolts of this. But I want to give you a chance to, I know, as much as it must be very difficult to present this idea in kind of an elevator pitch form, right? It doesn't really lend itself to that because it's a complex idea that requires a full evidentiary case being laid out. But undoubtedly, you've had to nonetheless sort of compress it into that elevator pitch. And I'm wondering what form that's currently in, if you had to give people the ride up and the ride down of what this book is, what your case is saying, and what the principal evidence is for it.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for having me on, and happy to talk about this. So our book can really be boiled down into one sentence, and that sentence is, there is more than one issue in politics. Now, of course, that seems obvious, and everyone would agree if you pointed that out to them, and they might say, well, why did you spend an entire book writing about there's more than one issue in politics? But the problem, of course, is that the dominant intellectual framework that almost everyone uses to describe our politics today is a unidimensional left-right spectrum. And a unidimensional spectrum can, by definition, only measure one thing. But if politics is about more than one thing, there's more than one issue, then why are we using a single horizontal line that can only measure one thing? Well, if you point that out to people, the most common response that they will give is they say, well, of course it's true that there's more than one issue in politics, but the reason that a left-right spectrum is useful, they will say, is because all of the many issue positions are actually bound together by just one big issue. And so there's one essence that binds together all of the issues of Team Blue or Tribe Left, and there's one essence that binds together all of the issues of Team Red or Tribe Right. And so your stance on welfare spending or tax rates or aid to Ukraine or abortion or 100 other issues are all somehow bound together by your stance on this one big issue. Now, part of the problem is if you ask a dozen different people, what is the one big issue that defines the left-right divide, you'll get several different answers to what that one big thing is. And so I think that's part of the evidence for there being more than one issue in politics. But the one that we hear the most common one, the one that you'll read in the dictionary, is people will say, well, those on the left are in favor of change, and those on the right are against change. And so your attitudes towards change is really what determines left wing and right wing. And so Team Left's current bundle of issue positions in favor of aid to Ukraine, against tariffs, in favor of abortion rights, against charter schools, or whatever it might be at any given time, is all bound together by the fact that they are all in favor of change. And Tribe Right's issue positions in favor of tax cuts on income, but in favor of higher taxes on imports, and against aid to Ukraine, and against abortion, and so on and so forth, are all bound together by the fact that they are against change. Now, if we examine that, we find that it really doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Both of our major political parties, Democrats and Republicans, both of our major political tribes, those who call themselves progressives or liberals and those who call themselves conservatives, each want to change some things and maintain the status quo on others. It just depends on the issue. And we can also see historically, and I think this is one of the things that you're interested in, is if we go back and look historically, the bundle of issue positions that has been considered left-wing or right-wing at any given time in history has been different at other times in history. So what the meanings of left and right are constantly changing, because these are actually just social groups rather than trans-historical philosophies binding together these issue positions. So that's kind of the argument of the book in a nutshell, that there's more than one issue in politics. We shouldn't be using a unidimensional spectrum to measure more than one issue. And we can talk about why maybe it's not just a scientific error, but it's also actually harmful for society.
Okay, yeah, it's certainly an important follow-up. And so I think, one of the issues that I'm sure you've encountered is that your thesis and the case that you lay out, although it is quite common sense, especially when you lead with that idea that, of course, there is more than one idea in politics, we know that that's absurd. It's really rife with possibilities for misunderstandings. Right? And I'm sure you've encountered that. I think a big part of that comes from the fact that all of us really in the United States, because we are under the kind of axiomatic belief in the system without really interrogating it and questioning it very much, we have a tendency to examine the arguments that you are making about the left-right spectrum from within the left-right spectrum. And it's very difficult to deconstruct a system using the axiomatic beliefs of that system. And so I think that one of the objections that I've sometimes heard from people is something, after kind of perhaps an insufficient perusal of what you're actually saying, is that you're claiming that the left and right don't exist, that the left and right themselves are mythological, that it's not true that people who are for gay marriage are also for income tax cuts or income tax increases, and you're really not saying that these bundles of ideas don't exist, or that there's not demographic associations with those bundles in terms of types of people and urban versus rural and so forth. You're saying that the bundle of ideas, what's mythological is two things. One is that the bundle is actually represented by is created by some sort of universal philosophical cleaver that can cut everything and sort everything into two bins, all of which are associated by this one principle, like change or small government or a dozen other, compassion, tolerance, etc. But you're also saying that not only is the idea of a unifying theme a mythology, but also the idea that this basket has looked like this in a dependable, steady way through time, that the baskets are constantly changing and really just reflecting the needs of that particular institution at the moment. Is that fair?
Yeah, so maybe I'll take up the point you raised, which I think is a really important one, which is people will point out, well, you're saying that there's more than one issue in politics and that all the issue positions are not naturally or logically connected in this left-right way. But we do have to deal with the fact that in general, if I know someone's stance on, say, abortion policy, I have a better than 50-50 chance of predicting their stance towards aid to Ukraine. Now, you might think, well, that's strange. Logically, there's no reason why those two issue positions should have to go together. Why is it that people who are pro-life on abortion are also against military aid to Ukraine? And that has to be explained. And so what we present in our book is two different theories that purport to explain the correlations that we find between issue positions. And we call these two theories the essentialist theory and the social theory. So the essentialist theory is the one that I was explaining a little bit earlier, which is this idea that, well, the reason that people who are in favor of who are pro-life on abortion policy are also against aid to Ukraine is because there's a conservative philosophy that binds together their attitude towards tariffs and aid to Ukraine and abortion policy and income tax rates and environmental regulations, et cetera. And so there's an essence. That's the essentialist theory. There's some essence binding together all of those various issue positions. But we test that theory and we find it lacking for a variety of reasons. But notice that the essentialist theory would predict that because there's an essence binding together all the various issue positions, those issue positions held by those who consider themselves on the left or on the right would remain the same over time because it's the same essence, the same progressivism and the same conservatism that's binding together those issue positions. But we find that's not the case. As you say, what those who consider themselves progressive or consider themselves conservative believe in and support, and the issue positions they take are constantly changing. from year to year and from decade to decade. And it wasn't that long ago that we would have expected the conservative tribe or the Team Red to be in favor of using military force to spread democracy and to oppose Russia, right? And it wasn't that long ago that we would have expected those who consider themselves conservative to be in favor of free trade and opposed to protectionist tariff policy. And it wasn't that long ago that we would have expected those on Team Red to be in favor of entitlement spending reform rather than opposed to entitlement spending reform. So there's all these issues that change from year to year and from decade to decade. So it doesn't seem like the essentialist theory is very useful for understanding why we see these correlations. The other theory that we present in the book is the social theory of ideology and of left-right correlations. And this is the idea that the reason we see correlations, and I should note here, it's not actually a perfect correlation. It's better than 50-50, but there's a lot of people who don't actually bundle their issue positions in this way. But the reason we do see some correlation among the population is because people get socialized into thinking of themselves as being progressives or conservatives. And then they look around and see what those in their tribe are doing, and they go along with what their tribe is doing. So one of the most striking, I think, evidences for the social theory of ideology is the fact that we can see differences in how much issue positions correlate based on how much education people have. So the more education you have, the more likely you are to correlate your issue positions in this way. And that would make sense because people are taught the left-right spectrum in schools. They get taught this in their high school government class. They get taught this in their college political science 101 class. They are taught that there's a left-right spectrum and it divides the world into two and only two groups that are on one or the other side of this left-right ideological spectrum. But people who have not been taught to think in terms of politics in terms of the left-right spectrum do not naturally bundle their issue positions together in this way. They don't think, oh, well, because I'm in favor of increased spending on welfare, that I also have to be against charter schools, or I also have to be pro-choice on abortion policy, or whatever. They don't bundle them together in that way. So that's, I think, a really striking evidence for this. But we also see this in experiments. So political scientists have done experiments, and they've given people prompts or primes saying, so just use the example of the current president. Donald Trump has taken the following positions on these issues. What do you think about these issues? What's your position on these issues? And the nice thing about Trump for the purposes of this experiment is because he has taken a variety of positions on so many different issues, they didn't have to make up quotes. They actually had a quote where he was saying he was in favor of raising the minimum wage and against raising the minimum wage, right? And a quote in favor of pro-choice abortion policy and a quote in favor of pro-life abortion policy and so forth. And they would have a control group and a treatment group. And it was interesting that people who identified the most strongly as conservative or liberal, the people who thought of themselves as the most ideological, were the most likely to change their issue position based on the prompt that they got. That is, the people who thought of themselves as the most ideological were actually the most tribal. And so thinking in terms of a left-right spectrum actually makes us more tribal and more partisan, not less. So there's a lot of interesting evidence we can go into if you want more examples, but it's interesting how the meanings of left-right change over time. That's what we would expect from the social theory of the left-right correlations. It's not what we would expect from the essentialist theory.
I think this is a fascinating point that's very counterintuitive to a lot of people, that we tend to think of education in general as being a force toward recognition of complexity, right? And not the opposite, a sort of a reduction to simplistic binaries. But it appears, both from the research and I think I probably from just sort of casual observation, I think a lot of our listeners, all three of them right now, are likely to be people who observed that something is wrong in our political discourse, especially via social media. They're on Twitter, they're on Facebook, they're on Blue Sky, whatever it is. And they're noticing that there seems to be this almost kind of absurd subservience to a kind of an endless series of memos that are being delivered about how to adequately perform tribal allegiance, right? And that the people who seem able to get on board the most easily with these kind of facile 180s and seem to have no problem with the cognitive dissonance what they're saying might actually present to their own deeply held values are more educated. And I think that this probably gets into the role of storytelling that you talk about quite a bit in the book, and that if the essences that you're referring to are mythological, which it seems like they are, then it would suggest that people have an ability to tell a story to themselves about why the new information that they have to align themselves with is actually representative of their values. And that might be a challenge to somebody who has not spent a lot of time making arguments. I think of kind of the debate training that people do where it's like you argue both pro and con, you know what I mean? And it's like, it's not really what you personally believe. It's being able to make the effective argument, right? So it seems like you're saying counterintuitively, people have more education in addition to the sort of indoctrination factor that there's sort of a form of political propaganda that's delivered via education. And there's this tendency of well-informed, articulate people to be able to engage in that process of storytelling and reinventing their rationale in a way that consistently lines up to avoid that cognitive dissonance they would also feel.
Yeah, I think that's right. So in addition to the fact that education provides more socialization into left-right thinking because it's what you're taught by your teacher or your professor, and it's the way the students around you are also thinking, it's also true, as you say, that people with higher intelligence, more verbal intelligence, are more able to and more easily concoct stories to justify what it is that their tribe is doing at this time. And so we give an example of this in the book that, it's almost kind of a fun exercise that you can just actually come up with any random basket of issue positions, just come up with 5 or 6, and then come up with an essence that you think could bind together all of those random issue positions. And you'll be surprised how good you might be at being able to come up with a story to say, oh yeah, here's because of, the essence of assertiveness, or the essence of compassion, or the essence of conserving, or the essence of realism, or the essence of freedom, whatever it is, you can concoct a story to say why all those issue positions support that essence. And so that's what people who often defend left-right thinking will do. They say, no, you don't get it. Really, in the end, all the things that the Democratic Party are doing right now really are in favor of progress because of X, Y, or Z. Or here's why all the things the Republican Party is doing right now are really in favor of, against change and conservation because of X, Y, and Z. Even though the very issue positions themselves are changing from year to year, they'll come up with a new story. So in that way, left-right mythology shares something with astrology, right? Because an astrologist says, come in, tell me what month you were born in, and tell me about your life. And then the astrologer can concoct a story to say why everything about you matches your astrological sign, right? So, I was born in August, so the astrologer would say to me, okay, so you're a Leo, tell me about your life, and if I said, well, after high school, I joined the military, and she'd say, oh yeah, because Leos are brave, and you joined the military because you're brave, right? But if I'd said something else about my life, I graduated from high school, I went to college, I didn't want to join the military. Oh yeah, and that was a time of war and everyone was joining the military, but how brave of you to stand up to your, to the peer pressure and do what you thought was right. You can always concoct a story to make the facts fit your pre-existing theory. But what social science should do is make predictions, not simply storytelling. And where the left-right framework utterly fails is in predicting what the parties will do, the issue positions they will take in the future. I mean, just if you go back and look at the things that have happened in the last few years, whether it's on, pandemic policy or international trade or foreign interventionism, you would not necessarily have predicted the two parties to take in the issue positions that they have based on some philosophical coherence. It's because of historical contingency. It's because of people in those tribes wanting, as you said, to show how they are good members of the tribe, to virtue signal on social media or wherever it might be. Look how willing I am to go along with everything that my party does. That makes me one of the good people on the good side of the spectrum, as opposed to one of the bad people on the bad side of the spectrum.
And I think that brings up another aspect of the difficulty of making this argument and the danger of misinterpretation, because I think another common reaction, it's interesting, I think as long as you keep the argument very, very general, people will, my experience has been people are very supportive of the idea. Everybody feels, I think, kind of exhausted by the dysfunction of our climbing partisanship. And on some level, almost all of us are feeling the angst and the anxiety and the fear and the disruption to our communities, our families, our workplaces, our media. So everyone's aware of it, but when you start to cite specific examples that might be something that someone has actually adhered to as a philosophy, it kind of goes out the window. And I think of two things. One was research on phones with young people that Jonathan Haidt did, and whose research also kind of intersects your work quite a bit. Yeah. Who did a lot of work, for those who might not be familiar, on this sort of inherent moral quality of political belief, and whether, for example, conservatives are more prone to disgust, for example. And we'll definitely would like to talk about that work. But he also did a lot of work on children and screens, and he found that if you asked children, would you be willing to give up your phone? It's apoplectic responses, just incredibly, no, very, very vehement. If you ask them, would you like it if all the phones disappeared? The reaction's very positive. They are like, that would be great, right? I see kind of an analogy in how people seem to regard the left-right spectrum, that as long as you're saying, don't you think it would be good if we got less partisan, if we just stopped all of this othering of each other and lining up to do ideological battle, in a constantly shifting landscape of sort of deliverables that were being given. And they're like, yes, But then if you point out something that they have personally adhered to about taxes or Ukraine or any of those other issues, the hackles go up very quickly. And I think there's probably there's a tendency to believe that you are implying that their values are fake. That if they're concerned about abortion, for example, if they're concerned about a woman's right to choose, if they're concerned about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, any of those issues, that your argument is saying they don't actually care about those things, that their compassion is fake, that their moral stance is fake, it's just the result of a tribe. And I understand that reaction, although I think it's misplaced, right? Mm-hmm. What would you say in reaction to that to maybe change people's perception of your argument? Yeah, no, that's a great point. So, and this is, partly our fault for not being more clear in our writing. And, if we, of course, were writing the book now, we would write it differently. But one of the common misperceptions from people reading our book or hearing our argument is they say, well, you're saying that people can't be philosophical, but I'm philosophical. You're saying people can't be principled, but I'm principled. And what we are actually saying is not that people can't be philosophical or principled. What we're actually saying is the less you rely on the false left-right framework, the more philosophical and principled you will be. Because left and right are false
philosophies. They're not trans-historical, enduring sets of political principles. They are social groups whose ideas, values, attitudes, and issue positions are constantly changing. And so left and right is about who, it's not about what. It's about what group you belong to, but it doesn't give us very useful predictions about what issue positions someone who identifies as left or right will take in the future. But it will give us good clues about what groups or people they will support and hate in the future. It allows us to predict who, it doesn't allow us to predict what. And so what I would encourage people to do is to say, look, I have my own values, my own philosophy, my own principles that here's what I care about, here's the issues I care about, or here's the philosophical beliefs that I have that have led me to take the issue positions that I have. But then think about politics in terms of that rather than progressivism and conservatism, because those philosophical labels, those ideological labels, are too bound up with the constantly changing issue positions of our political parties. And so if you think of yourself as I'm on the left or I'm on the right, I'm a progressive or I'm a conservative, then you're on a never-ending fool's errand where you will always be trying to justify what your party is doing and come up with a story as how it matches with your progressive or conservative philosophy. But think through take an inventory yourself. What matters to you based on maybe your religious beliefs, maybe the family you were raised in, maybe the community that you care about, maybe certain issues that you really deem are important. Take stock of yourself, think about here's my principles, and then look out at the two parties and say, oh, what do you know? Both of parties have some things I like, and both parties have some things I don't like. And that's okay, that's normal, that's human, that's the nature of politics. Both of our parties are baskets of issue positions, and inevitably for each person, each party's going to have some things you like and some things you don't like. That's fine. What would be rational is to look at the two parties, compare them, and say, well, I prefer this party right now to the other party. I'll vote for it. I'll support its candidates. I might even identify as a Democrat or a Republican. But as long as I don't partake of the delusion of left-right monism, then I've spared myself from the necessity of justifying everything my party does. Because I don't operate under the delusion that everything the Democrats do is bound together by progressivism and social justice. And I'm not operating under the delusion that everything the Republicans do is bound together by conservatism. I recognize that they are baskets of issue positions. And I'll be critical when my party does something I don't like. And I'll praise them when they do something I do like. And if they switch issue positions on things I really care about, I might even change which party I support. That would be rational. That's the way most Americans thought about politics and talked about politics for most of American history. It wasn't until the past several decades that people have started thinking, oh, there's this left-wing philosophy that binds together all the Democratic Party's issue positions, and there's this right-wing philosophy that binds together all of the Republican Party's issue positions, and one party's correct about everything because they're on the correct side of the spectrum, and one party is wrong about everything. That kind of thinking leads to, I think, unnecessary hostility and anger and tribalism that you're talking about.
So you, I think, would want to be very clear that your argument is not against any position that anybody holds in particular, nor is it an impugning of their the authenticity of their concern. Nor even is there any objection to identifying with a party,
right?
But it's purely recognizing that the identification with that party or with that value simply doesn't imply anything about anything else that you think. There's no reason that you have to take this as a package that you can pick and choose. And which I think makes a lot of sense. One of the things that I'll come back to that. I just want to mention it so that we kind of remember to talk about it. Yeah. But I am really curious about the kinds of drivers, both in terms of human nature to the extent that we can determine what that ever is, and the kind of incentive structures that are baked into our institutions, our political institutions, our economic institutions, that seems to keep driving it towards the idea that in identifying as a Republican or identifying as a liberal or a progressive or whatever it is that your identification is, it's not simply a way of stating your support for a particular position. It's your way of saying, I am on the good team. I know who the good team is. I am part of the good team. There is a bad team that's messing everything up, and they're trying to destroy everything. And I would definitely want to get to what kinds of factors are really driving us continuously towards that. But I think this would be a good segue to start talking about the historical context and development of the left-right spectrum, which is very different, I think, than a lot of people conceptualize. And the reason I think this is a great segue and an important part of your argument is that, if the joke comes to mind of two fish who are hanging out talking, and the third fish comes by and says, what are you guys talking about? And the two fish says, well, we're talking about what it's like to live in water. And the other fish is like, what the hell are you talking about? And what's that? Right. When something is so axiomatic, there's a tendency to, and I think this is key of kind of like cultural and social myths that are very dominant in general. They have a tendency to project backwards in time and rewrite all of history through their own interpretation. So, we have always been at war with Eurasia phenomenon, if you will, from 1984. And so I think the average American, I suspect, I don't have the polling data to back this up, would think that, roughly speaking, there was some founding fathers, there was a Revolutionary War, they wrote a constitution, and in that moment, the left and right were created and began their eternal warfare against each other. But that's not even remotely really the historical context. So maybe you can give us a little breakdown of that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question and a great point. And I think one of the reasons that people do assume that this left-right dichotomy is natural or universal is because, unfortunately, historians have gone back and applied left-right thinking and a left-right framework to historical figures who did not use that language or that vocabulary themselves. So, as you know, for most of human history, human beings have had politics, but not the left-right spectrum. That's a relatively recent phenomenon in human history. It dates back to the French Revolution, where the delegates to the Estates General met together, and later in the French National Assembly, when the delegates would meet together. And at that time, at the time of the French Revolution, there was one big issue that they were discussing and debating. And so a unidimensional spectrum kind of made sense to describe one big issue, and that was the French Revolution. Are you more or less in favor of this democratic revolution? And so it came to be seen that those who were more in favor of the revolution tended to be sitting on the left-hand side of if the speaker is looking at them, and those who were less in favor of the revolution or opposed to the revolution sat on the right-hand side. And so there was a kind of unidimensional spectrum running from left to right, being very in favor of the revolution, kind of in favor, kind of against, and very against the revolution. Well, that was used at the time in the 1790s to describe French politics, and it was kind of limited to that case, but it was picked up a bit in the 1800s by communist revolutionaries who wanted to see their project as a continuation of the French Revolutionary project. And so they thought of themselves as on the left, and people who opposed their revolution as being on the right. Most famously, this emerged during the Bolshevik Revolution in the 1910s, when Russian revolutionaries continued to use this language from the French Revolution and saw themselves as the revolutionaries being on the left and our opponents being on the right. Now, this, fortunately for the United States, Americans were unaffected by this. This was not the way Americans thought and talked about politics. If you go back and look at documents from the 1700s and the 1800s, you will not see the terms left and right used in a political sense. Now, you might come across, the phrase left wing or right wing as it relates to architecture or military formations, but not in terms of politics. But that changes, unfortunately, in the 1920s and 30s, when first journalists reporting on the Bolshevik Revolution start to adopt that framework in describing what was happening in Russia, because they said, well, these are the way the Russian revolutionaries are talking about themselves, so we're going to report on that and explain to our American audience that there's this thing called left and right, and this is the way they describe their, kind of internecine socialist battles within the Russian Revolution. Unfortunately, in the 1930s, it kind of makes its way into elite discourse and describing American politics. In the 1930s, it made a little bit of sense in the American case because the one big issue facing America in the 1930s that everyone was discussing was the New Deal. Are you more or less in favor of FDR's New Deal? And so it started to be used in a way to say those who are really in favor of FDR's New Deal are on the left, those who are opposed to it are on the right. Now, notably, the people who were in favor of the New Deal were the ones who disseminated that framework. And they liked it. They thought of themselves as kind of democratic revolutionaries opposed to the oligarchy, opposed to the aristocracy. People who were opposed to the New Deal didn't like that framing, and they didn't really adopt it. And so you really only had one party using the language of progressive and conservative. Democrats were using that language, but Republicans really weren't. It didn't finally kind of become a part of the mainstream bipartisan American political discourse until the 1960s, when in 1964 the Republican Party for the first time nominated a presidential candidate who called himself a conservative. And so now you have Republicans adopting this left-right framing, and now you have both parties bought in. And so since the 1960s, it's really taken off exponentially in the United States. It's trickled down from kind of an elite phenomenon among historians and journalists and political scientists, where now ordinary people will use this language of left and right to describe our politics. And so today you can't turn on cable news or open a newspaper or read political news on the internet without people using this language of progressive and conservative, left versus right. And unfortunately, I don't think this is the only reason that our politics has become more hostile and angry and dysfunctional, but I think it's one of the reasons that our politics has become more angry and divisive, is because when people think of politics in terms of a unidimensional spectrum, even if they don't explicitly say it, they're implicitly acknowledging that there's one party that's correct about everything because all of their issue positions flow out of the correct philosophy, and there's one party that's wrong about everything because all their issue positions flow out of the wrong philosophy. And so even if they're not conscious of what's happening, implicitly they're assuming that there's a philosophy that has everything figured out and a philosophy that's wrong about everything. And so it causes, I think, our political discourse to become much more heated and angry than it would otherwise be if we didn't have that left-right framework. If we just talked about the issues, then I think people would recognize, oh, every person I meet from either party is going to be someone who I agree with on some things, I disagree with on some things. That's normal, that's human, rather than saying, well, all I need to know is what side of the spectrum they're on, and then I know if they're an ally or an enemy.
Okay. And so very different history than most people are much more recent than most people are considering the left and right to be. And but even during that time period, I think we can really see that a lot of the current beliefs, really, I guess I would say stereotypes is what they really represent about, say, Democrats or Republicans or conservatives or liberals, turn out to be quite inaccurate. So, for example, if you asked people now, who's the religious sort of moralizing party, the one that's going to try and ram Christianity down your throat, and most people would say, well, that's the Republicans. That's a big reason why I'm against them. Mm-hmm. What would you say about that in a larger historical framework?
Yeah, so the issue of religion or Christianity, of course, has changed drastically over time. So, I mean, if you want to look at historical parallels to Donald Trump, you might look at William Jennings Bryan, right, who was a Democrat who was considered by many to be a progressive, and he wanted to, basically use popular discontent with the status quo to radically transform the American economy and society in ways similar to Trump. Christianity was a very important part of Bryan's candidacy. He used religious language heavily throughout his campaigning and his messaging to kind of heap scorn upon elites and those who controlled the heights of power in culture and in the economy, and to fight on behalf of, the ordinary America and the working class, middle America. That was his whole shtick, and that was considered liberal in 1896. That was what the Democratic Party did. Today, that same approach to politics is considered conservative, and it's what Republicans are doing. So, it's very interesting how these things change over time. One of the things that I think happened was in the 1970s, you had a lot of Christians, evangelicals, who were less political. They were less partisan than other sectors of society. Catholics had historically been solidly democratic. Evangelicals were less partisan, less political than other groups in America. But they really started to get solidified around a variety of social and cultural issues in the 1970s, abortion being one of them. And at the time, it was not clear which party was going to be the pro-life party and which was going to be the pro-choice party. If anything, historically, the Republican Party had been more pro-choice. The Democratic Party had been more pro-life. If you just go look at the candidates that they nominated, the kinds of things that were being talked about, that's what you would find. But because of a variety of historical contingencies, the candidacy of Ronald Reagan brought in a lot of these evangelicals into the Republican Party for the first time. They cared about certain religious, moral, social questions. And then they adopted the other issue positions of the party as a matter of socialization, just like we describe in the book, where before they didn't necessarily believe in supply-side economics, but now they were in favor of supply-side economics, right? And they would adopt these other issue positions, and so they would think of themselves as conservative and think of themselves as buying into the entire package. Now, of course, that group, evangelicals, has become very much instantiated within the Republican Party. They very much consider themselves overwhelmingly to be conservative, and they have changed their issue positions over time as the Republican Party has changed.
And so you bring up a point that has to do with the distinction between the essentialist and social theory, right? So this the social theory would claim that tribal allegiance is rather than political conviction or philosophical principle is driving these ideas, and in particular that there's an anchor belief that might be, for example, being pro-choice or anything else, and that there's a genuine, profound connection for whatever reason, whether it's because of a parent or because of a personal experience. There's a profound anchoring to that issue, right? And that once that issue is adopted, the person is going to naturally find themselves associating with people who feel similarly. They're going to be maybe going to, meetings. Maybe they're going to be getting involved in politics. Maybe it's just, what church they attend or any other social function, right? Yeah. And as that happens, the sort of normal demands of tribal allegiance that are hundreds of thousands of years old, probably, for humans, start to kick in. Like, I am now around these people because I anchored to this idea, and I want to get along with these people because they're the people that believe this thing in the way that I do. So I don't really care that much about taxes. If, everybody's like for taxes and they're with me on abortion, like, oh yeah, totally, sure. We should also definitely cut taxes, right? So the social theory and that kind of anchoring issue is another way of explaining why people anchor to a tribal position. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Yeah. So I think that the social theory explains that anchoring and then that socialization into the bundle of issues. But what's interesting is for some people, their newfound political identity often becomes now even more important than whatever issues brought them into the community in the first place. This is different for different people. Some people, that issue matters so much to them that if their party changes its position on that issue, they leave the party. They go to the other party, they become independent, whatever it might be. Other people, Now, actually, what's more important to them than that issue is their newfound political identity of progressivism or conservatism. This kind of, in their minds, this worked out philosophy that explains the world and binds together all of the issue positions of their group. And so as their group changes its issue positions, they might actually change their stance on the issue that they thought brought them into the coalition in the first place, which is really fascinating. And I think that happens less in partisan politics when you don't have that left-right spectrum. If you look back in American history, before the introduction of left-right thinking, we had the rise and fall of a variety of political parties. Third parties would emerge, replace one of the two major parties. This happened frequently because people saw themselves as, here's my issues, here's my philosophy, here's my principles, and I'm going to look out for the party that has the things that I want more than the others. And if neither party has it, then you might have a third party emerge that's going to replace one of those two major parties. People were kind of kept their parties a little bit more at an arm's distance. They recognized that they were tools to achieve certain ends and healthy for democracy, and parties provide a really important function, and two-party systems can be very valuable for a political system, for its health and its continuity and its stability, and keeping those in power in check. For a variety of reasons, a two-party system can be very healthy and good. But once you introduce the left-right framing, now you have to justify everything that your party does because it has to all flow out of what you think is this coherent philosophy. And it makes you justify everything your party does in a way that you wouldn't have otherwise. And it makes you criticize the other party and be hostile in a way that you wouldn't have otherwise been if you didn't think in terms of that left-right spectrum.
And what you're describing in terms of an anchoring position that then maybe a party shifts on, and some individuals are like, I can't hold on with this transition. It's too big a shift. That would be me,
okay. Yeah.
For example. Yeah. And I think probably a lot of people who are drawn to what I hope this show is going to be an investigation of, right? That there's a sense that something is wrong and that there's something very dysfunctional afoot at that point that, like, and our producer Steve, I think he and I have had some, Steve, we've had some great conversations about this issue that kind of like launched the show, that both of us were finding that deeply held beliefs that we had were suddenly out of favor. And, for me, for example, I grew up in a very progressive family in the South Side of Chicago. It was during the Vietnam War. I kind of came of age in that period, and my father was profoundly anti-war. He was a veteran that came back from World War II with very profound PTSD. He became a pacifist. He passed that on to me. So embracing nonviolence is probably one of my strongest values. Yeah. Right. And when I started to find that the progressivism that I had normally associated myself and identified with was seeming more and more to be in favor of militarism, it became harder and harder for me to resolve the cognitive dissonance that was occurring as a result of that. Yeah. And I never felt that there was a possibility that I would then just go join the other team. It seemed sort of ridiculous, not because the other team was ridiculous, but it just sort of seemed like, well, something larger is wrong here than simply that the party that I used to associate with support for this idea no longer seems to be. Something is afoot about, something is different about the structure of this whole system than I thought. Yeah. And that ultimately led me to be sort of a confused, tribeless, politically homeless individual who was more and more getting into conflict, not intentionally, not by desire, with other members of my tribe. Yeah. And even other members of the other tribe for just sort of not playing the game correctly. Yeah. Right? There's a way that you play the game, and it causes a sort of a disturbance in the force when you stop playing according to those rules. And I'm just wondering what. If you have found that those individuals who got sort of, let's say, gray-pilled, I guess, as a result of that experience, have wound up embracing this mode of analysis and these arguments that you're making, and what those people might have in common, or what you have found about their experience.
Yeah, so it is interesting that the people that we find that are interested in the book or that are amenable to the arguments of our book, ironically don't share necessarily any one or two or three issue positions in common. But what they do share in common is a commitment to principles, to political principles, and a anxiety about or exhaustion with political tribalism, and an ability to recognize what's happening, thinking, well, I deeply care about issue X or Y or Z, and my party used to be in favor of that or really cared about that, but they've switched on that position, on that issue, and now I feel politically homeless, and I don't just want to go along with my tribe. I actually still care about this issue or this principle, and it still matters to me. And so I think that cognitive dissonance is often the gateway for people to see, oh, I realize now that this left-right framing is not very useful. So I think this issue that you mentioned about, militarism and pacifism is a really interesting one. And it's one of the issues that's probably been flip-flopped on by the two major parties, by those who consider themselves progressive and conservative, the most, maybe more than any other issue in American politics. If we think about, the most famous progressive president at the height of the progressive era, Theodore Roosevelt, he kind of defined what it meant to be a progressive for many Americans for many years. And he was very much a militarist and an internationalist that thought that the United States should carry a big stick and use force around the world. And that was considered progressive for many decades. But you're exactly right. In the 1960s and 70s, that changed as Republicans took control of the presidency and the White House and began intervening more and using military force around the globe. Now it switched where progressives increasingly thought of themselves as anti-war, and conservatives increasingly thought of themselves as more militarist or more interventionist. And this changed again in the 90s when those who supported the Democratic Party wanted to justify some of the foreign interventionism by the Clinton administration, and those who were opposed to the Clinton administration, Republicans in Congress, all of a sudden kind of revived their old non-interventionist or isolationist or anti-war sentiment from previous decades. And then in the early 2000s, during the Bush Jr. administration, they flipped again because now it was Republicans in the White House prosecuting the war in Iraq, and now that was seen as a conservative position to be pro-war, and now it was once again seen as progressive to be anti-war. And then it switched again, and now we have Republicans much more isolationist than they were just 10 or 15 years ago, much less non-interventionist, much more skeptical of military intervention overseas. So that issue is flip-flopped back and forth many times. So I think for someone who really cares about that issue, then I think the left-right framing is even more clearly and visibly faulty and flawed.
Yeah, for me, certainly, and also the fact that I think the most accurate working model when you start to make those realizations that you're talking about is that the tribe that is in power when a war is occurring is in favor of that war.
Yeah.
And the tribe that is out of power when a war is occurring is not in favor of that war. There's certainly bipartisan support for some wars, sure. But and I think this gets back to a lot of your arguments about, say, for example, change or preservation, keeping traditions, right? That's often kind of thought of as a possible essence that separates those ideas, right? Yeah. That, teams tend to be for changes that create their favored policy and against changes that don't.
Yeah.
So no one is really for change or against change in the same way that you pointed out quite well in your book with very compelling evidence that no one's really for big government or small government. They're for the government doing the things that they want the government to do and not doing the things that they don't want the government to do. And when they're criticizing the other team who is trying to do things, they might call that big government. But then as you kind of use George Bush Jr. as an example there, right? So maybe you could talk about that a little bit, kind of the big government mythology.
Yeah. So as we mentioned, the most common one we hear, people who believe in the left-right spectrum say, well, the real difference is the left is in favor of change and conservatives are against it. But another one we get a lot is they say, well, the left is in favor of big government and the right is against big government or in favor of small government. That's the one issue. And all of the hundreds of smaller issue positions are really bound together by being in favor or against big government. But again, the historical analysis really just bears this out to not be the case. Sometimes conservatives want big government, depends on the time and place, and sometimes people who call themselves progressives want big government. It depends on the time and place. So let's just look at different issues, right? So people who call themselves conservatives currently want more government intervention when it comes to regulating abortion policy, but less government regulation when it comes to regulating environmental policy, for example. They want more government and more big government when it comes to regulating drug policy, but less big government when it comes to regulating gun policy. Just depends on the issue. And of course, it also changes over time. So as we mentioned earlier, in the 1990s, Republicans frequently criticized the Democrats for being in favor of big government. They said, oh, those liberals, they want to expand the state and want big government. And us conservatives, we want small government. That's what it means to be a conservative. But of course, once they took control of government, they flipped. And now Republicans started increasing the size and scope of government more than had ever been seen in American history. Bush 43 increased government spending more than any president in American history, increased government deficits more than any president up until that time, and drastically increased the size and scope of government through military spending, national security, this idea that America could use its military to export democracy around the world, including social welfare programs, a massive increase to Medicare spending, and really no cuts to any welfare or social program spending during the Bush administration, only increases across the board on domestic and military spending. So all of a sudden, Republicans were now in favor of big government. And then, as you point out, it depends on who's in power. Once they lost power again during the Obama administration, then they kind of went back to their old language from the 90s, which was critical of big government and saying Obama is a socialist, and now it's the Tea Party, and now we have the Freedom Caucus, and we're against big government. But of course, now that Trump is back in power, a lot of the people in the Freedom Caucus or the Tea Partiers actually have been in favor of the vast expansions of the size and scope of government during the Trump administration. To this day, the Trump administration holds the record for government spending, $7 trillion. To this day, the Trump administration holds the record for government deficit spending, vast expansions of the size and scope of government with no entitlement spending reforms. And so now you don't really hear that much about limited government or small government as much from people who consider themselves conservatives. I know there is some of this symbolic stuff around Doge, but it's not actually decreasing government spending. And in some ways, it's just used as a way to centralize power in Washington by using the executive branch to dismiss people who aren't on board with the president's priorities. So it is interesting, on big government versus small government. It depends on the issue. It depends on the time and place. There is no essential difference between these social groups, left and right.
And I think just so in case anyone is thinking that you're kind of cherry picking, like, well, sure, for that one, I encourage them to do this exercise with any issue the way that you were suggesting, with trying to find the story that explains the essential connection between any two randomly generated issues, right? So if you pick something like bodily autonomy, right, you can see ways in which both parties are for or against bodily autonomy depending on the context. So, for example, with the current Democratic / left-wing position, the bodily autonomy when it comes to women's right to choose is favored. Bodily autonomy when it comes to choice of, say, vaccines is not favored. And of course, not weighing in on whether any of those are right or wrong or anything else, but just pointing out that every single issue that you can pick, if you're willing to look, really displays this sort of bifurcated structure. And I think it's also important to point out that the argument that you're making here, I would not say is accusing anybody of hypocrisy, because you're not really saying, oh, look, these people are being hypocritical and believing this and that. You're just saying there is a very compelling force that shapes all of us as humans, that interacts with our emotions, interacts with our sort of evolutionary programming to stay in good standing with the tribe. Because I think it's important to point out, from an evolutionary standpoint, being expelled from the tribe was a death sentence, right? I mean, essentially for a hunter-gatherer, right?
Yeah.
So it may not seem quite so powerful now. Although I would say the consequences, obviously, of being canceled and so forth can be very significant, losing your economic support and so forth. There's just some very powerful machinery inside of us that makes us understandably and legitimately terrified of being expelled from our peer group, and that whether this is being consciously manipulated or not is an interesting question, and one that I would also like to talk to you about. But it's not as I think that people will often make this argument as a kind of a gotcha politically in discourse, say on social media, like, oh, look, you're doing this over here, and look at your hypocrisy, right? Yeah. But everybody's doing it. Yes. Everybody's doing it all the time. So I think that we have to have a more morally neutral, more sort of compassionate explanation for why this is happening and how this is happening. And that might be a good time to kind of steer the conversation towards what forces, both historically and presently, are maintaining and reinforcing this spectrum. Because obviously, tribalism is very old, right? We've always been tribal. These kinds of motivations and aspects of human nature have always been present, and yet things are changing very dramatically in terms of the rate of tribalism. And maybe this would be a good moment for me to show you some of this data that we came up with, and just kind of curious about your reaction to it. So this is from Pew Research, 1922, as part of a much bigger series of polling questions about partisanship in general, party identity, and all of that. And, we can see that in keeping with, I think, what everybody sort of already knows, right, intuitively, our opinion of each other has plummeted over the last 10 years or so, right? Seemingly, the data here is from 2016 to 2022, but a lot of the things that I've looked at, it seems like there was some really significant turning point around 2013, kind of a peak that happened 2013, 14, and very alarming growth, right? So something is causing these natural tribal instincts we have to be exacerbated dramatically. So we can see that more and more people are thinking of each other as closed-minded, dishonest, immoral, unintelligent, lazy, and all four of these, in fact, right? And this is, of course, both Republicans thinking this about Democrats and Democrats thinking this about Republicans, right? This is information from Google's word frequency website, which takes all Google books and looks at word frequency over time. There are texts that go back as far as 1800, so that's why we have that as the left end of our time axis. And on the vertical axis, we have the percentage of total words that is represented by that term. And I, of course, want to point out that we want to be kind of careful about assuming too much from this data. This is a particular data set. It's Google Books. The collection of books is not a representative sample of all speech taking place between all people. Writers of books, especially if we're looking at the 19th century, are going to be disproportionately educated, literate, right? Which, literacy was probably 40, 50%, right? overwhelmingly white male. Right. So I don't want to try and pretend that these graphs necessarily are causative, but they're still very interesting. So we're looking at, obviously, the frequency of left wing and right wing. And maybe you could just take a second to, if this does, sort of agree with the basic historical picture that you gave us of that terminology and that concept. You could sort of say a little bit about in what way that's the case.
I know that I think these graphs are actually very illustrative of the point. I've used similar graphs in my own book talks and presentations. But you're exactly right. You can see here from Google Ngram, when we're looking at English language publications, this use of these words, right wing and left wing, is a relatively recent phenomenon in American history. It really, as you see, takes off there in the post-war era. But before that, people didn't think and talk about politics in terms of left and right, or left wing and right wing. But since the 1950s and 60s, it's really taken off. And this is the dominant way most people think and talk about politics. These words get used all the time. But we have to be so careful, because the assumption in thinking about politics in terms of a left-right spectrum, we're thinking of people as left-wing and right-wing, it assumes something that's simply not true. It assumes that politics can be usefully modeled on a unidimensional spectrum. But of course, we know that there's more than one issue in politics, and so we shouldn't be using a unidimensional spectrum to model the many issues in politics. And as we've discussed today, there is no one essence that binds together all the positions of people who call themselves conservatives. There's no one essence that binds together all the issue positions of people who call themselves progressives. And this is not just an intellectual or a category error, but as you pointed out with your earlier slides, we think this has real moral harm to the way that we treat each other in politics, because the way we think about other people influences the way that we treat other people. And so if we think about people as residing somewhere on this flat unidimensional spectrum, on this x-axis somewhere, then we assume that we know everything there is to know about them, politically speaking, just by placing them somewhere on this line. And it totalizes all the complexity of politics into this flat unidimensional spectrum. And it says, well, everyone that I meet is either going to be a friend on my side of the spectrum or an enemy on the wrong side of the spectrum. And I don't actually need to engage in good faith conversation or discourse with that person, because either I already agree with them, in which case I have nothing to learn from them, I agree with them on everything, or I disagree with them on everything, and I know that they are wrong about everything because all of their issue positions are informed by the wrong philosophy. And so I have nothing to learn from them in that case also. And so I have nothing to learn from them. All I can do is dominate them, destroy them, and win in politics. And the ends will justify the means, because my correct side will win, and whatever we have to do to defeat the other side will be justified. So that, again, even if we don't explicitly or consciously think through all those logical steps, that's what's implied by using the language of left and right. So I don't want to say that, people who think in terms of a left-right spectrum are bad people or stupid people. I'm just saying they would be smarter and more charitable than they already are if they got rid of the left-right framing, because then the implication of going granular and not thinking in terms of a left-right spectrum is every person I meet in any given day is going to be someone that I think implicitly is right about some things and wrong about some things. And that's normal, and that's human. And I want to have a conversation with them, and I want to hear the reasons that they give for why they believe what they do. And even on the things that I disagree with them, because I might be wrong, and I'm open to that. And after having that conversation, I might still think they're wrong, but at least I've engaged with them in good faith. I've respected their humanity and their rationality and their morality as a human being, rather than saying, well, you're just part of this good group or this bad group, and kind of dismiss in that way. So I don't think it's coincidental that the rise in the use of the left-right framing in the post-war era since the 1950s and 60s has also correlated with the rise in the political hostility and anger that we see between our two major parties.
And just going back for a second, it's probably worth pointing out that we can see in the time period from roughly 2010, 2012, something like that, there's been a really dramatic rise in the use of right wing and left wing as a framing, right? So Interestingly, this often gets framed from the standpoint of polling as the left has moved to the left and the right has moved to the right. Given the various problems that you have been talking about with the spectrum, it seems like that statement doesn't actually mean anything. And maybe you could talk about that for a second.
Yeah, so what people often talk about, and unfortunately many of my colleagues in political science will talk about party polarization. And I think it's problematic to use that language of polarization because polarization assumes poles on a unidimensional spectrum. And so the common claim is, though the Democratic Party has moved to the extreme left and the Republican Party has moved to the extreme right. But as we've talked about today, the meanings of left and right are constantly changing. So it's actually nonsensical to say that a person or a group or a party has moved to the left when the very meaning of what it means to be left has changed over that exact same time period. So, choose whatever issue you want. On some issues, the Democratic Party has become more extreme. On some issues, they've become less extreme. And on some issues, they've changed their position entirely, right? So if we go back to, maybe look at the issue of free speech on college campuses. That was, a big thing in the 1950s and 60s. That was seen as a left-wing issue position or a progressive issue position. People who were liberals wanted more free speech on college campuses. People who were conservatives were critical of the free speech movement on college campuses. And today it's almost flipped, where you hear a lot more talk about free speech from people who call themselves conservatives, and people who are critical of free speech more often identifying themselves as progressives or liberals. So to say that the Democratic Party has moved to the extreme left, what does that mean that they've done on free speech? Does that mean that they've become extremely in favor of free speech? Well, no, actually, they've changed and flipped with the Republican Party on that very issue position. So it doesn't make sense. And to take another example in contemporary politics, I'll just use the example of Donald Trump because he's the president right now and he's the most talked about political figure. But if we think about, has the Republican Party moved to the extreme right? That's what people claim when they say, the two parties have polarized. The Republican Party has moved to the extreme right. And almost everyone will tell you, they are so confident, Donald Trump is an extreme right-winger. He's an extreme conservative. And so we have to think through, well, what are the implications of that claim? So if we go back to the previous presidential candidate that Republicans nominated, Mitt Romney, most people say, he was center-right or moderately conservative, and Donald Trump is far-right or extremely conservative. So according to that logic, we would think that Donald Trump has simply taken all of Mitt Romney's issue positions to the extreme. So Mitt Romney was moderately in favor of using military intervention internationally to spread democracy. So does that mean that Donald Trump is an extreme interventionist on foreign policy and is an extreme militarist that wants to use the military internationally? Well, it depends on the issue, right? Maybe with regards to Greenland, but not with regards to Ukraine necessarily, right? Or take another issue like entitlement reform. Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan, his running mate, were known for being in favor of entitlement reform, wanting to decrease spending on Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. So does that mean that Donald Trump is an extreme cutter of Social Security? Well, no, actually, that's one of the issue positions that he's been very consistent on over the past decade, is that he's against cutting Social Security spending. And as president, he did not decrease. So that would tell us something false about his issue positions if we were to assume that he's taken those positions to the extreme. Or take another issue position. Romney was known as being moderately in favor of free trade and wanting lower tariffs and more international trade. So does that mean that Trump is an extreme free trader and has taken that issue position to the extreme? Well, that doesn't make sense because he's actually an extreme protectionist that has drastically increased tariffs on imports. So does that mean that he's moved to the left on all these issues? Well, that doesn't really make sense to say that he's a left-winger either. It's just he has his own unique bundle of issue positions. Trump Republicans are different from Romney Republicans, which are different from Goldwater Republicans, and they're just different iterations of conservatism. And so it doesn't make sense to say the Republican Party has moved to the extreme right when the very meanings of right have changed. It doesn't make sense to say the Democratic Party has moved to the extreme left when the meaning of left has changed.
So it would probably be more accurate to say that when we talk about extreme right and extreme left, what we are talking about as extreme is not so much the issues, it's about the loyalty itself, right?
Yeah, so the language, when I hear someone say, oh, he's an extreme right-winger or she's an extreme left-winger, what I'm hearing is not, I don't know what that means in terms of issue positions. I don't know if they're in favor of aid to Ukraine or in favor of free trade or want higher taxes on the rich. But what it tells me is, oh, they're extremely committed to the tribe, because left and right are simply groups. They're social groups. And if you're extreme left-winger, you're extremely committed to the tribe that calls itself left-wing. And if you're an extreme right-winger, you're extremely committed to the group that calls itself right-wing, and you're extremely beloved. So when someone says Donald Trump is extremely right-wing, I know that he's beloved, extremely beloved by people in Team Red, but I don't necessarily know what that is going to look like in terms of issue positions until he says something or acts in a way that I can say, okay, that's what the issue positions are now, because they're very different from what it meant to be extremely right-wing, 10 or 15 years ago.
And I think that this really gets to one of the big topics that we really hope to get to today, which is the kinds of ideas, both on an individual sort of social level and maybe on an institutional level, that are driving the apparent endless rise in ideology. And one of the ways that the phenomenon that you're discussing would be sort of self-reinforcing. I think there's a lot of things that are self-reinforcing about the left-right spectrum. But if you start thinking of people as extreme, and actually if we can, I'm just going to go back to this first slide for a second. When people are saying that they are extreme left-wing or extreme right-wing, in general, they're always talking about the other tribe.
Yes, yeah.
And so what they are actually talking about is their own opinion of that tribe. That they're saying the tribe has gotten more, if you're on the left tribe, you're saying the right tribe is getting more extreme. And what that really means is I personally hate them more. Yeah. I disapprove of them more. I think they're more immoral, more dishonest, more closed-minded, more unintelligent, lazy, and so forth, right? Yeah. And it's fascinating to me that if you go deeper into, I don't have this particular shot, I wish I'd grabbed it, but Pew kind of makes an attempt to explain this through a kind of how democratic are you, how right-wing are you, how left-wing are you survey. And it then shows these kind of left and right distributions, these blobs, that sure enough, over 10 years start moving apart. And you have to dig very hard into the appendix to find out where that index actually comes from. How are they coming up with those numbers?
Yes.
And it's entirely self-reinforcing. All of the questions are essentially just, how much do you think the other side is terrible?
Right.
And so it comes down to saying more people think the other side is terrible because more people think the other side is terrible.
That's exactly right.
And so, of course, that's...
Oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, just on that same point, I was going to say, if Pew instead had taken a battery of issue positions and tracked them over a long period of time, say 30 or 40 or 50 years, it becomes very difficult to say that the Republican Party's moved to the left or the right and the Democratic Party's moved to the left, because the positions of those parties have actually changed. So it might be the case that the people in those parties are taking more extreme positions than they did in the past, but it might be the opposite of what the party did in the past. And we've even found that problem with our book, because it was published 2.5 years ago now, and I was rereading it a little bit this morning in preparation for our conversation, and I noticed some of the examples that we gave are actually becoming out of date because the parties have changed their own positions on the issues that we used as examples of what we were talking about. So anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt, but
no, not at all. That's a great point. And so it seems like maybe another idea that might be referential here, self-reinforcing here, is that if you start to have these beliefs about other people, then it's going to be natural that you should not associate with those people. Maybe you shouldn't even speak to them, and you certainly don't need to speak to them because you understand already perfectly what they believe. They all believe the same thing. It's all consistent. It's all based on some kind of terrible principle. So there's no reason to talk to them. And certain kinds of behavior that we might have previously thought of just elucidation become sort of betrayals to the team. So for things like platforming, right, which was not really an idea before, that there could be something inherently wrong with simply allowing a particular idea to be expressed, right? And carrying water, one of my favorites, right? You're carrying water for, often that translates to, you are saying something true that helps this other team. So whether it is true or not, is irrelevant, because it helps the other team, and that's the main thing, because we fundamentally know that the other team is bad. Yeah. So that's going to create bubbles, obviously, and it's going to be self-referential, right? And so I think that we have some understanding of that. What I'm interested now, I'm really curious what you think about, is some of the institutional incentives and structures that and maybe even technological changes that might have occurred that caused this particular narrative to grow, become dominant, and to sort of assume a form where attempting to push back on it itself is going to create kind of like a viral immune response, where there's something really maintaining this system against all of our wishes, because most of us are really tired of it, right? When you ask them, if you take people out of that conflict. And seeing that this is happening in, kind of beginning in the early 19th century, around the World War I period, I'm wondering what you think about the historical forces that might have been occurring during that time period that lended themselves to the adoption of this idea. In particular, I'm curious about the birth of formal techniques of propaganda. I'm thinking about things like the Committee for Public Information and Woodrow Wilson's attempt to sort of drum up support for World War I, and the very coordinated, very large-scale propagandistic movements that they initiated to make that happen. The PR industry is kind of like really cutting its teeth in this time period, and becomes kind of dominant in advertising, in corporate representation during that 1920 to 1960 period. Association is not causality. Yeah. But I'm curious what you think about the role of advertising, propaganda, media, evolution of technology in the propagation of this idea.
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think changes in technology have played a big part in this rise of left-right thinking. And I agree that there are institutional structures in place that incentivize the use of this intellectual framework. So maybe I'll start with the political parties. So I don't think either of our two major political parties consciously necessarily adopted this framing, as some kind of conspiracy against the public good. But I think what they found is that it was helpful for them as party leaders, as party activists, and as members of party organizations to accomplish their particular goals, which were not necessarily in the public interest. So, if you just think about the ways that our two major parties fundraise, they often use this language of left and right to get people to click on buttons on the internet to donate money, right? Click on the big green button, make sure you donate, or in letter writing campaigns. If they didn't use this language, they would not be as successful in getting the donation. So imagine, Blake, that you get a letter in the mail from the Democratic National Committee saying, Dear Blake, we're the Democratic Party, and we stand for a variety of issue positions on taxes, abortion, military intervention, trade, gay marriage, etc. And we hope you'll agree with more of these issue positions than not. Please donate to our campaign. Well, you're going to look at that and say, well, probably not going to donate, right? But if instead the Democratic Party sends you a letter that says, Dear Blake, we are the progressive party in favor of social justice, and we are opposed to the right-wing reactionary fascist forces on the right. And we are standing against the rising, creeping fascism in America. Donate today to save the republic. Well, now you're a little bit more motivated to donate, right? And so this is the way that our two major parties benefit from using this language of left and right, because it allows them to cast our politics into a simple morality play of heroes and villains. We have all the good guys on our side. They have all the bad guys on their side. It's obvious who you should donate to and who you should vote for and put us in power, right? So our two major parties have an incentive to keep up this mirage of left-right thinking. I think changes in technology have also allowed for many journalists and news organizations to be incentivized to keep this left-right framing going. So for many years, American national media, at least, was pretty centralized into a few major networks, and their incentives were to appeal to as many Americans as possible to tune in or to subscribe to their paper. And so they tried to reach a broad audience, and they typically did not frame things in a left-right way of here's one party that's right about everything and here's one party that's wrong about everything. But with the fracturing of the media landscape and the decentralization of media, now what you have is the profit incentives are such is that your best bet is to get a niche of the market and really go all in on that market. And so you have the rise of, cable news organizations that now think of themselves, MSNBC, for example, thinks of itself as in favor of the Democratic Party, as a progressive news outlet. And so it's catering its message to people who identify as Democrats or identify as liberals. And so their news programming is going to be telling people in that tribe, everything our party does is right, and here's why it's right, and here's why everything the other party doing is wrong. Likewise, Fox News has the same incentive. It's just catering itself to people who identify as Republicans and conservatives. We're never going to get the progressives to tune in. We don't want them. We just want these people who identify in this way. And we're going to tell you everything the Republican Party does is correct. Everything the Democrats do is wrong. And so cable news is more amenable to this approach. And then also, of course, with social media, now there are, algorithms in the social media platforms that say what gets clicks is telling people that their identity is correct and the other guys are all wrong. And so we're going to continue to push this left-right framing to say that your side is correct, the other side is wrong. And so I think it's spread on internet, on cable news, increasingly in newspapers, where that is kind of the structural incentive in place for not only our political parties, but now also for our media companies.
So it seems like, and I think your point about the cable news is super important. It seems like there's an element of this is good business to the left-right spectrum, right? And it's like one of the things that's fascinating to me is if you think about MSNBC and Fox News, for example, I think most people think of those as like different worlds, right? But if you look at the economic structure of the companies, they are overwhelmingly similar, not different, right? There's a kind of a shocking number of executives that go back and forth between the two. They made the donuts over at Fox, and now they're making the donuts over at MSNBC.
Yep. And
they don't seem to have any ideological issues with that because it's a job. And the investors are major investors to Fox News are BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. The top three investors of MSNBC are BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. This reminds me a little bit of, I think of Marshall McLuhan when this point comes up, that it's kind of an example of the media as the message a little bit, that the shape of these institutions is very similar. Both of them are able to profit from this idea of a simple binary. As you've pointed out, institutions like parties, and maybe not just parties, but lots of institutions, are going to find something appealing about a populace that is easily moved in their position through simplistic binaries, because it's very hard to convince people of things making a nuanced argument, but it's much simpler to manipulate people into a position that you want. And again, I'm not trying to get conspiratorial. This is normal.
Yeah.
This is the whole way that advertising functions, right? This is not about bad people or somebody rubbing their hands in a back room. It's just normal institutional structures, right?
Yeah.
And incentives. So I that's maybe part of why I wonder about that birth of this idea sort of happening in the early teens and 20s, is that I think of, in particular, Edward Bernays comes to mind, who, and this kind of gets this idea that there's individuals who seem to be operating at a level above the left-right spectrum. They use it, but they seem to know. It's almost like a drug dealer that doesn't use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They're selling it, but they don't use it.
Yeah.
So Edward Bernays famously was a very progressive figure who advocated for universal suffrage and tolerance of free expression in terms of advocating for risque plays, and but had absolutely no problem advocating for united fruit and the overthrow of a democratic government in Guatemala, right? And it's sort of an extreme, what we would think of as a right-wing position.
Yeah.
And so it does seem like there's institutions and individuals who are very, very ready to use this idea, but they don't to use it as a good leverage point, to kind of insert their crowbar, but they don't seem to believe it themselves. And I've wondered if you spent any time thinking about looking at that, the individuals who don't go along with the left-right spectrum and yet seem to be utilizing it.
Yeah, no, that's worth examining more, and I'm not as familiar with that literature, but I do think you're onto something when you talk about the way that our media companies operate. I think increasingly many of them, especially cable news outlets, what the product that they're selling, as far as I can tell, is not necessarily information. They're selling fear and outrage. They're selling a particular emotional reaction from their viewers that they know their viewers are going to come back, and turn on and let's see how I can scare myself again today, or get angry at the other side again today. It's kind of like, I think the analogy of drugs is actually useful. It's almost like a drug hit. I need to go back and click on that link again, or I need to go back and turn to that channel again and hear how everything my group is doing is right and good, and how everything that the other side is doing is wrong and bad. Now, it is interesting, this graph you're showing. I don't know how much you've played around with Google Ngram, but you can put in different terms and get slightly different curves. So if you put like a hyphen between right and wing and left and wing, you'll get a slightly different curve or a space. But there is consistency, as you say, is it really takes off. In the 1920s and 30s, it was when you see the first emergence of these slopes, and then it becomes kind of exponentially increased in recent decades. And I'm not exactly sure all the reasons why, but as best as we could tell from our kind of historical inquiry, it starts the first, if you look at when those words are used and how they're used and in what publications, it begins in the 1910s with reporting on the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and then in the 1920s, you start to see it increasingly applied to the two major political parties. Senator LaFollette, for example, from Wisconsin, wanted to think of himself as creating like a progressive wing of the Republican Party, and then the Democrats would do the same thing. There would be a progressive and conservative wing within the Democratic Party. And then I think you start to hear the language of liberalism really used by FDR in the 1930s. Ironically, he used that word in many ways the opposite of what it had meant in the 19th century, but he refashioned that word to mean something different in the 1930s, and a lot of people bought in to that new definition of the word. And then eventually in the 1950s, with the advent of publications like National Review, increasingly Republicans started thinking of themselves as conservatives for the first time. And then, as I said, in the 1960s, they nominated a candidate who called himself a conservative, and I think it's taken off from there.
That kind of leads us into some of these other graphs. So like, as you pointed out, if you put far left and far right, you get a slightly different result than just left and right, but still increasing. I thought this was pretty interesting. Tribalism itself almost perfectly matches the rise of left and right as terminologies, so which seems to be, in a sense, evidence for the idea that we've always known that this is a form of tribalism, right? They're kind of rising and falling in lockstep. And if we look at some of the terms, you were sort of alluding to this, that liberalism in this phase over here in the 1800s is really a very different word than liberalism once we get into, the post-war era.
Yeah.
And we can see that liberalism and conservatism have not really risen or fallen together as opposites at all historically. We didn't necessarily, liberalism existed before conservatism even really kind of entered into the common parlance, right?
Well, and an interesting one about that, so if you go back and look at the etymology or the historical roots of the word liberal, where it was used and who used it, it goes back even much farther than 1800, but was never used in a political sense. So liberal might mean that you were free and open, you might be generous in giving to the poor, but it wasn't necessarily a political position or a political philosophy. Adam Smith famously used the word liberal to describe the system that he was trying to advocate for in the 18th century. He thought that free markets would lead to the wealth of nations. He called it the liberal system. This liberal meaning it was open to free trade, it was open to free markets, it wasn't trying to control what people were doing in economic transactions, it was liberal in that sense. Now it takes on a political meaning in the 19th century with the rise of a party in Spain who were basically constitutional monarchists. They wanted to restrain the power of the absolute monarchy in Spain. So they used the term liberalisme. They used liberal in terms of we want liberty and in opposition to the king, to restrain the powers of the king for more liberty for the people. So then it spread from the Spanish language into other languages, French and English, to start meaning, well, liberal means you want less government power. You want to go back to the earlier discussion about big government versus small government. In the 19th century, liberal meant smaller government, free trade, more individual liberty, less economic regulation. And so that term was used in a political sense in the 19th century in that way, but it changed in the 1930s to kind of mean the opposite, which was FDR saying, well, actually liberal means you want the government to intervene to ensure freedom for individuals, to make sure that people have a right to housing and a right to education and a right to a job and these things. So it's now became more activist government rather than restrained government. Something similar happened with conservative. Again, these words, both liberal and conservative, have non-political meanings. You might occasionally these days encounter people using those terms in a non-political way, although it's almost exclusively in a political context. Just, conservative in the sense that, well, I'm more risk averse, right? Not necessarily in a political way, just. So that term was used. It took on a political valence in America in the mid-19th century for people who were kind of thought of themselves as moderates. They, especially during the slavery crisis, they weren't, the fire eaters or the abolitionists. They were kind of in the middle of that one issue, in which it might make sense to have a unidimensional spectrum to talk about the one issue of slavery. They saw themselves as the centrists or the moderates on that one issue. That's kind of what conservative meant. Lincoln called himself a conservative in that way, that he wasn't taking an extreme position either way on the issue of slavery. But it doesn't really take on the left-right valence in America until the post-war era. And the same thing with liberal. It doesn't get attached to the left-right spectrum. Liberal doesn't until the 1930s. And that's when it, as you showed in the previous graphs, left-wing and right-wing take off. And now today, liberal is basically synonymous with left-wing. Conservative is basically synonymous with right-wing. But it is interesting how these terms do fall and rise in favor. So initially, the people who used to call themselves progressives, like in the 1910s and 20s, that label fell out of favor during the Wilson administration. During World War I, there was a backlash against the policies of the Wilson administration, against American involvement in World War I. And so a lot of the people who had previously called themselves progressives, which was most Americans at the turn of the 20th century, both Republicans and Democrats, most people thought of themselves as progressives, stopped using that term. And then Democrats in the 1930s kind of replaced it with the term liberal to represent the similar bundle of issue positions that was in favor of more government intervention in the economy, more social programs for the poor, and so forth. But then, as you know, that label also took on a more negative connotation, liberal in the 1990s. Democrats didn't want to really call themselves liberals. Republicans frequently wanted to call Democrats liberals. And so then the term progressive kind of made a comeback, especially during the Obama administration, where Democrats started using that label. So it is interesting to track kind of the rise and fall of these different terms.
So if there's maybe an overarching point here, it's that not only is the issues associated with left and right over time flexible, but even the terms that we think of as synonymous with left and right, that liberals are left and progressive, that all of these terms, in fact, have their own independent history that don't march in lockstep at all in the way that we're sort of led to believe.
Yeah, and even I think you're right about historically, but also around the globe, you can see in different locations, these terms have different meanings and valences. So if you go to Europe and someone uses the English word liberal, they might be referring to what you might think of as right-wing issue positions about free markets and limited government and so forth, right? And sometimes the word neoliberal is used in kind of a pejorative fashion to say, those are the people that are trying to scale back government and have free markets and free trade. But of course, in an American context, we often think of liberal as people who have the basket of issue positions that's currently more in favor of more government intervention in the economy. But of course, that changes.
Yeah, absolutely. And as while we're talking about Republican and Democrat, there's that usage, which it's hard to know what pattern to make out of that. I don't know if you have anything in particular to say about it in relevance of what we've been talking.
Yeah, that one is interesting, and I'm not exactly sure what to make of that, except that, if we think back historically, at least in the American case, and I'm less familiar with cases in other countries, the term Democrat was kind of seen as a pejorative term. You didn't want to be thought of as a Democrat necessarily at, say, the late 18th century or turn of the 19th century. That was seen as, that's kind of the people who are radically in favor of mob rule, like in the French Revolution. A lot of Americans thought of themselves as Republicans. We want a republic as opposed to a monarchy. So, famously, Thomas Jefferson's political party that he started in the 1790s with James Madison, they called themselves Republicans. Now, historians, we go back and say, well, those were the Democrats, but they didn't use that term for themselves. They called themselves Republicans to emphasize that they thought of themselves as being opposed to monarchy. That was a common dichotomy that was drawn, monarchy versus Republican. And they wanted to paint their political opponents, the Federalists. They would sometimes call the Federalists monarchists or monocrats. They would use that term to say, you're in favor of kingly rule, and we're the ones that are in favor of the people. We're the Republicans. And so Democrat wasn't one that they really voluntarily took on until really the 1830s with Andrew Jackson, where we had a major political party calling itself Democratic. And then, of course, you have the rise of Lincoln's Republican Party in the 1860s. And the reason they chose that name was to hearken back to the party of Jefferson. Lincoln wanted to say, we're really the true inheritors of the Jeffersonian tradition, not those Jacksonians, because we're the ones that take seriously the Declaration of Independence and its claim of a self-evident truth that all men are created equal. And that's what us Republicans believe in, because we're opposed to the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. So that one is interesting. I'm not sure exactly how to follow that one, but I do think some of the history between the uses of those terms historically is really interesting. The other thing you might get a different result on this particular graph is instead of using the term Democrat, use Democratic.
Yeah.
And that might be more analogous to Republican.
I'd love to talk a little bit about sort of the personal struggle of trying to follow this path. And the first thing I'm wondering about in that regard is, I had been sort of talking about how for me personally, there was these experiences that I was having that kind of pushed me out of the left-right spectrum. I couldn't hold on to the cognitive dissonance anymore. And it just sort of left me with a sense that my fundamental understanding of the world was broken in some profound way, and I needed to start this process of reinvestigation. I'm wondering if you had anything analogous for yourself before you started this academic project, or if the academic project was more than influencing sort of your personal interactions.
Yeah, so I think I'm probably the rare case where the academic was important for me, and this is probably a good place for me to emphasize that this book is really the brainchild of my co-author, my brother Hyrum Lewis. He's definitely the first author on this book. You'll have to interview him next. He'll be much
Absolutely.
better interviewee than I am.
You're doing fantastic. I wouldn't say that, but
but I can still remember. I, like everyone else, just grew up being taught that politics can be usefully modeled on a left-right spectrum. This is the way everyone around me in my life thought and talked about politics. This is what I learned at school. And so I used this language for most of my life, progressive, conservative. And then I can still remember, this is almost 20 years ago, where I was when my brother, my co-author, Hyrum, was visiting, and we were having a chat about politics. And he made this point to me that, well, the meanings of conservatism and progressivism are constantly changing. And the left-right framework doesn't really make sense to think about moving to the left over time or moving to the right over time. And it just stuck with me. And so we just kept having conversations over many years about it. I was doing other things in graduate school and with my first book, which was related on this topic. And so I became more and more interested in it. We kept talking about it. And then he started drafting chapters for the book and was kind enough to bring me along onto the project, and we just kind of continued on it from there. So yeah, I think he was one of the first person that pointed it out to me, and but once someone points it out to you, it's almost like the emperor has no clothes. Like, well, yeah, of course,
Yeah.
but no one is willing to say it until someone points it out for them. And so as I was saying earlier, when you meet someone who has this same realization, it's like meeting a long lost brother. It's like, oh yeah, you get it too. Like, of course, there's more than one issue in politics. Why are we using this crazy left-right spectrum? But I do think the recent events in politics that is being covered frequently in the news has given people more openness to this idea as they see the parties changing their issue positions frequently, and as they see, as you point out, the rising level of hostility, anger, what seems like political dysfunction. People are thinking there's got to be a different way to talk about our politics. And I think when people come to that realization, they're more open to this idea that, yeah, what if we get rid of the left-right framework and just talk about the issues?
Yeah, and it does seem to be a growing movement, which I think is great, and I'm sure that your book is having a major impact on that. And certainly the reason that we were so excited to talk to you today. And I'm also just wondering, beyond that, given that the institutions that we've been discussing don't show any signs of slowing down their commitment, not only slowing down their commitment, but doing everything they can to sort of gatekeep the nature of our political discourse and keep kind of a stranglehold on that discussion. And it strikes me that it possibly the idea that the left and right could also serve as a kind of a pair of bookends of acceptable debate, and therefore kind of as a means of sort of control of discourse. There's the left and the right, they oppose each other. If you're out of that, you're automatically wacky, right? Because it's a way of sort of defining the field of play of political discourse, and I could see how that could be an incentive. But how do you, as an academic, I think you're doing a little bit more than academic analysis. There is an advocacy to what you're doing. Your tagline, how the political spectrum misleads and harms America, is not neutral. there's a real cost here, and you're trying, I think as I am, at least in intention, to try and make the world a little bit of a better place for us to be able to have meaningful discourse that views each other's full humanity. How do we go up against, other than the thing that we're doing right now, which is a perfectly very important and acceptable step to say this is what we need to do? What other kinds of things can we do, given how dominated most of our means of being able to communicate with each other and receive education and information are inculcated within this idea?
Yeah, I am not naive about the prospects for success in getting rid of the myth of left and right. It's a firmly entrenched myth in our political discourse. And sadly, as you and I are speaking right now, in classrooms around the country, there are students in high school government courses and Intro to American Politics courses that are being told that this is the way to think about politics, right? And even as we speak, there are newspaper articles being published that use this framing. There are, cable newscasters that use this framing. So I know that it's an uphill battle. Maybe this is, Don Quixote tilting at windmills. I don't know that in my lifetime we'll ever get rid of the myth of left and right, but I think it's still worth trying, and it's still worth fighting the good fight. So, what can we do? I think it starts with just ordinary people changing the way they think about politics. I think in some ways the left-right myth is kind of like it's an addiction, and the way to get rid of an addiction is to recognize you have a problem, right? Alcoholics Anonymous, the first step, I have a problem, right? I think that's what we have to do with left-right thinking. Recognize that it's a myth, that there's more than one issue in politics. And the meanings of left and right are constantly changing. And these simply refer to social groups, not trans-historical, coherent philosophies. So I think that's the first thing. And then you and I and everyone we interact with, we can do our best to try to just go granular, just talk about the issues. And if we want to refer to the group of people who call themselves progressives or conservatives, we can talk about the party, Democrats and Republicans, or Team Red and Team Blue. Because then I think we're communicating something true, which is we're talking about a group of people, rather than reifying the fallacy of left and right, which is that there's just one issue and that there's two philosophies, and that's the acceptable realm of political discourse. So, just talk about the groups, use group labels when we talk about groups, Team Red, Team Blue, tribe left, tribe right, and then use ideational labels when we talk about ideas, equality, freedom, change, conservation. Those are all ideas, and we can use those when we're actually talking about ideas, but don't confuse that with the left-right tribes, which are constantly changing, and they're simply groups of people. So it is hard, and I find myself every day having conversations where I'm having to think through, okay, how am I going to respond to this question without using the language of left and right? Because it is hard, because when everyone else is using a certain vocabulary and you're trying to enter into the conversation, language is inherently a public institution. Okay? Language only makes sense in public. There's no such thing as private languages. We all have to engage in discourse with other people. So I just try to avoid using those words, left and right, left-wing, right-wing, progressives and conservatives. I just talk about Democrats and Republicans, and I talk about issues. Let's talk about tax policy or abortion policy or aid to Ukraine or whatever the policy is. Now, sometimes if someone's using it in a way that I think is really sidetracking our conversation, I might mention, look, I don't think the left-right framework is actually useful, so I'm not going to use those terms, and here's the way I'm going to talk about it. And you might get them to go along, you might not, and that's fine. So I do have, some moments where I'm pretty pessimistic that this will ever change, but I do have other moments where I'm more optimistic, and I have a little optimism for a couple of reasons. One is, for most of American history, Americans did not think and talk about politics in terms of a left-right spectrum. That's the norm. What we're doing right now is unusual. It's abnormal. It's a strange thing that we're doing by saying that politics can be flattened onto a left-right spectrum. And so if for most of American history we haven't done it that way, maybe right now it's just an aberration, and one day we can go back to doing it in the pluralist way, which is just simply to talk about the variety of issues, to talk about the two major parties as bundling together a variety of issues, rather than assuming that there's just one issue and only two philosophies. So I get a little bit of optimism from that. The other thing that gives me a little bit of hope is something that you've talked about, which is there's a lot of people in our country today who I think are exhausted by the political tribalism, the political hostility, the name-calling, the insults, the screaming at each other. And I think the exhausted majority of Americans are maybe looking for something new. And it is hard to change your vocabulary. It is hard to change the way you think. But I think that could be an impetus. The other thing that gives me a little optimism is what I find is when I give, book talks or talk about this, older people in the audience, I think, have a really hard time grappling with what we're saying because they've thought for decades in a certain way. And our brains are hardwired, right? And they can be wired in certain ways, and you have to rewire them in other ways. And it's just hard for people to give up a certain framework that they've used their entire lives. But younger people in the audience tend to be more amenable to what we're saying. They're like, well, yeah, of course that makes sense. There's more than one issue in politics. Why would we use a unidimensional spectrum? And they can more easily and quickly jettison the old vocabulary and adopt the new vocabulary. And so if that's the future, younger people are going to be the future of our political discourse, then maybe that gives me a little hope as well.
Well, that seems like a great stopping point, because we all need some hope in this situation, because there's plenty of reason for pessimism. So I think that this is a really important discussion, and I'm so appreciative of both you and your brother, both in writing the book and in doing all the work that you do to get that idea out there, out of concern for all of our ability to have a more healthy discourse. And I really appreciate you being here today. Thank you so much. Great. Thanks so much, Blake. All right, Dr. Lewis, we hope to have your brother on, and maybe you can come back a little later on after we had some episodes. And until then, best of luck with your work. Thank you so much.
If there's one thing to sit with after this conversation, it's this. What happens when the lens you've been using to understand the world starts to fall away? Because once you step outside of that left-right framework, even a little, you don't just see politics differently, you start to see systems differently, power differently, incentives differently. And maybe the question isn't just what do I believe, but what structures are shaping what I believe and why. In our next episode, we begin to follow that thread, looking at the origins of corporate power, the gospel of wealth, and the rise of institutions that will go on to shape not just our economy, but our reality. We're just getting started. We'll see you next time. This show was produced by me, Steve Ordauer, and Blake Minnerly. The graphic artist, editor, and social media manager is Carrie Tanner. And if this conversation resonated with you, if it made you pause, question something, or see things just a little differently, make sure to follow or subscribe to the show so you don't miss what's coming next. And if someone came to mind while you were listening, someone who's been thinking about these same questions, share this episode with them, because this isn't just something to listen to, it's something to talk about. Please be sure to drop us a like and follow us on social media, where we'll be sharing clips, ideas, and continuing the conversation beyond the podcast. Your support really helps us grow this and reach more people who are ready to think a little differently. We're building this in real time, and we'd love to have you be a part of it. Subscribe, share it, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for listening. I'm Steve Ordauer.
This has been a Rhythm and Light production.